Ahoy YouTube! It's Professor Mimi from CardFight Crash Course bringing you a deck tech today for Fenelle. Not necessarily for specifically new Fenelle, but we have new Fenelle in this deck specifically. This is the second time I'm recording this video, so hopefully it can be better than the last recording. Recording software sucks, and I feel like some of these people could benefit from retaking Computer Science 101. Enough about that, though. This deck is more focused on some of the tech and the math behind what makes Fenelle see success, because I see a lot of Fenelle decks that are playing just a little less trick and treats than I think might be optimal, considering how the math on the top 7 checks work out. So we're going to spend a little bit of time delving into the math on those, and a little bit of time going into some of the tech choices we're playing, and why we're playing those over some of the more mainstream options. The deck is an aggressive deck, but it is also very flexible. So like a lot of the other decks, like how recently we've talked about Alk and Chris Rain, who can be relatively adaptable to what you want to do. Fenelle is aggressive, but just like a lot of decks, you can tune some things here and there to make it fit your playstyle. And I have to give you some disclosure, I have not personally played this deck. This is Alicia's deck, but I've watched her play it lots, and I've talked with her about it a lot, so I feel like I'm still able to give you some very valid insights into how the deck performs and the choices that went into it. One last thing before we start though, if you have a frameware version of the 1 and the 0 and you see us at the BSF coming up soon, feel free to reach out to us. We've got lots of nice things for trade, and this is her girl, so she would be very, very happy to get some extra framewares of the ride line. That being said though, I don't want to spend too much time with this prologue of sorts because we have a lot to talk about. So we're going to jump right in, and we're going to lead with talking about the winning image so we can all be on the same page about what our game plan is supposed to be here. If you know one thing about Fenelle, you know that she is built around the order Trick and Treat, and she wants to be playing multiple in a turn. She lets you play 3 orders a turn as long as they are Trick and Treat or Regalis. Spoiler alert, this particular list has no Regalis piece in it, which I know might seem a little strange, but in the end they're not always necessary. We are playing 3 Snow and Sorrows at the moment, plus 12 more Trick and Treats, for a total of 15 Trick and Treats, because this is treated as Trick and Treat. You can only play 1 of it a turn, so she decided to not max out on it. And we'll come back to the numbers on this in just a little bit, on how many Snow and Sorrows she thinks she's going to play moving forward. But as it is, with 15, we hit a very good number of Trick and Treats in deck. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the concept of hypergeometric distribution, which I know is a big and scary word, but it is a very important mathematical concept to understand if you want to improve at card games. You don't need to sit here and learn how to do fancy combinatorics and all that. There is a wonderful calculator online at StatTrek, like Star Trek, but instead of star, it's stat, like statistics, stattrek.com. They have a hypergeometric distribution calculator, and that sounds scary, but once you know what it's asking of you, it's very easy to just put in some numbers and press calculate and see what it spits out at you, so that you can have some rough idea. Because if you put in your numbers and you're like, oh yeah, that's gonna work out great, and then you see that it's actually less than 50% likelihood to occur, then you're like, oh, maybe I should play more of that. Or you're like, how many should I play so that it reaches about 80-85% consistency? That's when you can say something is very consistent, and you can very much expect to see something when it happens about 85% of the time is a good number. The calculator will ask you for your population size. That's a more general term, but for us card game players, that's asking for our deck size. So in general, you can do it for 45 or 50, depending on what kind of checks you're going to be doing. Since we are trying to not keep a trick and treat in our opening hand, since our ride line searches out 2 from the top 7, we would like to make sure we're playing enough trick and treats where we are likely to find 2 in the top 7 even after 2 have been removed, so that we can see enough trick and treats and get the full value from our ride line. We need to be playing quite a few trick and treats, so it's not so bad to have so many of them, but it just means that you do need to be very careful with the resources and the slots that you do have. So if we have 45 cards in our deck, or 44, or even if the math works out, even if you run it for 50. Population size of 50, we'll ask for the number of successes in the population. Successes are the cards we are looking for in this particular case, so a successful trick and treat check would have trick and treats in it. That would be a success. So the number of successes in our population is the number left in our deck. So here that would start out at 15, but on that second check for top 7, we would already have removed 2. So our population size would decrease by 2, and the number of successes in the population would decrease by 2. Next, it will ask you for the sample size. The sample size is the number of cards we will be checking without replacement. So we're going to check, and we're not going to like check one card, shuffle, check one card, shuffle. We're going to check 7 cards in a row and look. So that's a 7 card sample. And then last, it asks you for the number of successes in the sample. So normally you just, if you were trying to check like, oh, I'm going to check my top 5 for grade 3, you just put 1. But we are specifically looking for 2 trick and treats in the top 7. So with the first Fenelle, when we have everything set up, the average amount of trick and treats in the top 7 will be 2.1, more than 2. So we are likely to hit both trick and treats. And then once our deck size decreases, because we removed 2, and our sample size, or our successes left in the population also decrease, that will make the second one less likely to resolve. But since we are playing this many, it still rounds to 2 as the average, and you end up having about a 69% chance, nice, of checking 2 the first check, and still a 60% chance of checking 2 the second time. So more often than not, each check will give us 2, which means we can expect to have 3 or 4 trick and treats added to our hand from our ride line, which is very important, because our winning image, of course, is for Fenelle to play 3 trick and treats every turn. Especially our first grade 3 turn, because we want to get, if we're going first, we would like to get 5, if we're going first, we would like to get 4 trick and treats, so our front row can get +8, because since our opponent's going to be on grade 2, we are going to need a little less power to hit those breakpoints. But if we went first, we're going to get to see 2 extra cards, so hopefully with those 2 extra cards, we'll find that 1 extra trick and treat we need to hit +10 to our front row. Having +10 on our front row, or if, +8, since our opponent is slightly smaller, the math works out to be about +10 anyway. With +10 to our front row, And our friend Strega helping fill up our board. I'm very sorry that this card is very expensive, but she is kind of a must-play. She's kind of our rearguard star of the show. She's very important because not only does she let us Soul Blast 1 to fill up the rest of our board, she can Soul Blast 1 to add a Trick and Treat to our hand so that we can continue to play them, especially later on in the game. Because sometimes you can find a unit card that can get you a Trick and Treat. We can build a board that will allow us to quite effectively push and still hold up some defense. So these cards are relatively standard in Fenelle, but this is some very interesting tech that Alicia has become quite fond of, Blooming Bop Dragon. It lets you on attack Energy Blast 3 to gain +5 and bounce a rearguard, but if you are at the standard version of Limit Break, which is being at 4 damage or having Persona ridden, so aka you just have to beat the end game. If you are at the standard point in the end game, then she can bounce 2 rear guards instead of 1. So since Trick and Treat allows you to call a card from our drop zone, we can use our perfect cards and then call them from our drop zone, and then use Blooming Bop Dragon to return them to our hand. And if we get the second bounce off of Blooming Bop Dragon, we can return one of our Trick and Treat searchers to our hand, so that next turn we need 1 less Trick and Treat in order to do our thing. And that thing, of course, is not just the +10, but when Fenelle attacks, she gives out the +10, but she also gives herself and one of your rear guards an additional critical. Now you're going to want to be very thoughtful with where you put the crit. It's usually going to be right to put it on the biggest attack, but of course in certain endgame scenarios that can be a bit contextual and you'll need to think about it. But for the most part, you generally put it on your largest attack, or whichever one of your attacks must swing Vanguard. So Blooming Bop Dragon, if it wants to bounce something, I'm almost certain, yes, when this unit attacks a Vanguard. So it cannot bounce a rearguard if it attacks a rearguard. Whereas Strega, in order to counterblast 1 and draw, has to attack a grade 3 unit card. One of our other things about this winning image here is that we can feed our opponent a concept I kind of call poison numbers, where once our opponent is at 4 damage, for the rest of the game, every attack that we swing Vanguard can be lethal, and we can make it so that they don't get an extra counterblast to push us, they don't get a check for their overtrigger or a defensive to help make our turn even smaller, and that our heals will be live without us having to go to 5 damage. So our heals are live for longer, leaving it possible for us to even double heal in certain endgame scenarios. So you need to be mindful of what you're doing with your extra attacks here. So if we can, in our early game, push them to 2 damage, then Fenelle will swing big with crit, and they might have a hard time blocking that, so they can easily go to 2 damage, or they'll take 2. If we check a crit, of course, we might want to push them to 5, so that we don't have to waste time swinging rear for the rest of the game, because that makes things much more challenging for them. If they're going to have to just block Fenelle, after they take Fenelle, they just have to block 1 swing, then they won't have to worry about the pressure from this side lane. But if they're at 5, suddenly you can swing all of your attacks at face, because it is of course quite possible that we don't win on our first grade 3 turn, so it's quite possible that we will need to win with our Persona ride. Our buff of course will be up to at least +20. Hopefully we can get it so that our front row will be at +26, because we'll have 3 more Trick and Treats in our drop zone, hopefully. So at +26, 6, a lot of these numbers could go to waste. Because once you Persona Ride, the new Fenelle allows you to restand one of your rear guards. And that is wonderful and all, but restanding a rear guard allows those counter heals to gain extra shield. The ones that if a unit has attacked twice this turn, it'll go up to 25k shield, which is a lot and exposes us to not just that one, but also the one that gets a crit. So if our opponent is at 5, then we can swing all 4 attacks at our opponent's face. We can swing with Strega, counterblast 1, get plus 10, attack with Fenelle, use Fennelle's skill to restand Strega, swing with Strega again, counterblast 1 to get another 10k and draw another card. So Strega can easily swing for 70 something. She can be absolutely huge, and then we can come in last with Blooming Bop and then return our Perfect Guard and our Trick and Treat Searcher to our hand to hold up play for next turn, so that we can use our Perfect Guards to effectively get to that next turn, and then we have our Searcher to make sure that our next turn can do something. However, if our opponent is at 4, sometimes that extra stand can be a little extra. You could have almost guaranteed game on board, and so sometimes swinging for 1 damage is just not very effective, and it can be very wise to just go straight in with Fenelle and swing in for that 2 damage. Because if you know that they're dead, having a crit to make sure that you do 2 damage that they need to check, heal, and over trigger, and not just one of them, can make it very threatening. So be very mindful of your extra attack. It is not always a good idea to use that extra attack. I know that sounds very silly, but an extra attack can turn on the heals to gain extra shields, so you'll need to be mindful of where you put the crit. So if you restand something and it's not very large, like you attack with Blooming Bop for some reason, and then you restand it, and then it's not big enough, like let's say our buff is like plus 24, and then Blooming Bop's gonna be kind of small, they can like check a defensive and then use that counter heal, and they can just 1 card block this, and then they can Perfect Guard or other swing, and you can get big punished for not having thought through your attack pattern. More attacks is not always better. In particular endgames, you need to be thoughtful and mindful behind all the decisions you make. So that's our winning image. We want to have at least 4 or 5 cards in our drop zone for the Trick and Treat buff early, and then we would like to have enough so that are getting plus 25 to our front row, because plus 24 does not quite hit the same breakpoints, especially if our opponent is grade 3. The 4K can be neat, like the 2 makes the Vanguard booster meaningful, the plus 4 makes this meaningful, but those numbers would be, these would be impactful, but this last column here would also hit a magic number if we could just have 1 more. And so then that brings us into a little more of our tech and what she was planning on doing moving forward. Snow in Sorrow is a very powerful card. However, she noticed there was one major problem with the deck as she was playing with it, and that is that compared to how the deck used to perform, she is consistently 1 trick and treat behind schedule in most endgames, and that 1 behind schedule tends to rack up turn after turn. And most of that is because when you play Snow and Sorrow, you can play it from your drop zone, which is wonderful, but when you play, it will return to the bottom of your deck, which will then make it so that your trick and treat count in drop zone is lower. So you need to be mindful of that, especially on your first grade 3 turn, to make sure that you hit that breakpoint, if you're only going to end up with 3 trick and treats in your drop zone and your front row is at +6, that is not meeting our winning image here. That is not going to be enough. So as much as trick and treat's first effect is pretty blah, and of course you want to play Snow and Sorrow since you can play it from your drop zone, and then you get because it resurrects something, you can choose a non-sentinel normal unit from your drop zone and call it. That's wonderful, especially considering we didn't have to play anything from our hand, but that is going to reduce our trick and treat count. So if playing it from drop zone is going to make it so that our first grade 3 turn isn't going to hit our magic numbers, it is wise to not always just snap play this. Make sure to think and count how many trick and treats are in rotation before you play Snow and Sorrow. In fact, it keeps being consistently behind schedule where she's considering simply playing one singular copy of Snow and Sorrow, since it's a very powerful card, but we do have a way of effectively resource looping our grade 1 that searches the deck for trick and treat. Especially since we can use Snow and Sorrow to call her from our drop zone. Snow and Sorrow will return to the bottom of our deck, skill, counterblast 1, search Snow and Sorrow, then we can discard it to one of our perfect cards and play it again next turn. So you don't necessarily need to have multiples. So that is some clever insight for you. Going forward, you might want to consider trimming some Snow and Sorrows, because Snow and Sorrow is great, because it fixes one of the major weaknesses of Trick and Treat. Trick and Treat has 3 effects. Since you can play it 3 times, each time you do it, she has a little different trick for you. The first trick is the weakest. Your opponent gets to choose, and that's part of what makes it a little bit less useful than the others. Your opponent can bottom deck a rear guard. If they do not, you draw 1 card. And that puts the ball in their court. They might have some useless plant token, or maybe they had to random call a trigger with a recruiter effect, their own Strega, and they're like, oh, I'll just put this heal trigger in my back. That's great. I was really annoyed that I had to call that. Thank you. And then you don't get your draw, and you would really like to get your draw. The second effect is to draw and countercharge. And then the third effect, similar to Snow and Sorrow, lets you call a card from your drop zone, except unlike Snow and Sorrow, which calls a non-sentinel normal unit, this is just a grade 3 or less unit card. So you can call back your sentinels, you can call back your overtrigger, and then we can use Bloom and Bop Dragon to bounce them. You can even do something very funny, where you can use Strega to find, it's like you use Snow and Sorrow, call Strega. Strega was called by an orders effect, so Strega can Soul Blast 1 to check our top 5 and call something. We call a perfect guard, and we play our 2 more Trick and Treats. Trick and Treat calls us another perfect card, call Bloom and Bop Dragon. Blooming Bop Dragon, bounce both of our sentinels. Now that's spicy. That's pretty good. Because Fenelle can be quite challenging to block for multiple turns in a row, but of course that's balanced out by the fact that you're playing 15 order cards. You do not have much shield. Not very much shield at all. You have to make very good use of what you do have. So being able to effectively reuse your perfect guards and turn your Trick and Treats into a kind of shield, because you have to discard something to your perfect guards, doesn't matter what, but you have to pick something, like a Snow and Sorrow that you can play from your drop zone, you can effectively squeeze out more turns than you would have otherwise. And that's why she likes it the way she has it right now, except for, of course, the consistently falling slightly behind schedule on her Trick and Treats. Now, I don't know how many of you are super keyed in on the BCS circuit, but there was an event in Puerto Rico, if I'm not mistaken, that Fenelle got 3rd place, and we can take some inspiration from that. But just because a deck did well, again, it didn't win the tournament, and that tournament, not to cast any shade or doubt on that player and their wonderful achievement, but it was one of the smaller events, so they didn't have to play as many rounds as some of the other larger tournaments. So a deck that is less consistent can manage to see just a little more success. So we're going to take their achievements with some grains of salt, and then of course some people can disagree with Alicia's opinions, so we can take her deck list with a grain of salt as well, and you, the audience, can come to your own conclusions about what sort of cards you would like to run. Because if you are a math doer, you might have noticed that since there are 20 land cards in our deck, 16 triggers and 4 perfect cards, we're not shaving any perfect cards, we're not that crazy. If we're playing 15 trick and treats, that only leaves us with 15 other slots in our deck to make work. So a third of our deck approximately is triggers, a third of our deck is trick and treats, and a third of our deck is units we actually want to attack, plus some perfect cards sprinkled in there. We end up having a very difficult time fitting in all the cards we want to fit in. In fact, we've only got 5 cards of each grade. We have 3 of our trick and treat searcher here, because once we find one, we can effectively reuse it by picking it up with Blooming Bop Dragon or just calling over it and then calling another copy of it from Drop Zone. We can effectively resource loop Eldeel here, who isn't live until slightly later than her, because we have to be on a dress up. Again, I suppose if we can play in order 2. Or you played in order this turn. Yeah. But she's not as necessary as our searcher here, because we need to find our trick and treats, and this is just kind of like icing on the cake, right? We can effectively loop it because it'll move to our soul, and then we can use Strega to soul blast it, and then we can use Snow and Sorrow to call it back. And we can use them turn after turn. We have a playset of Strega. Sorry for your wallets, but you gotta do what you gotta do in one ace unit. There is a alternate artwork reprint of Strega from the Koro set. It's still quite pricey, but it's slightly less pricey, so it could save you a few dollars if you know that exists. And by a few, I mean like 28. And 2 Blooming Bop Dragons and 3 Persona Rides, bringing us to 1 Fenelle of each rarity, so we can enjoy all of her wonder. That's 5 cards of each grade, which gives us a relatively linear power curve. Aside from the fact that, of course, Fenelle herself is going to be quite a large power spike. You may or may not notice that aside from Fenelle herself, we're not playing any of Fennelle's new support units. And the only main deck card, other than, of course, Trick and Treats, that really is Fenelle specific is our Searcher. The rest of these are not Fenelle specific cards. There are some Fenelle specific cards that you could consider playing. There was a grade 1 from the new set. She was like Vibrant Cracker, Bright Cracker. I promise it's not a slur. I promise. She calls herself from the drop zone if you've played once you've played your 3rd trick and treat for the turn, and then she can gain power and move herself to the soul. But you have a very easy time filling up your board, and you don't really have very many issues with your soul, because kind of the only thing that's soul blasting is really Strega. Because if you use Snow and Sorrow to call a card from your drop zone, that's 1. If one of those cards you call is Strega, so we call Strega. Strega will recruit us somebody, so we get some grade 1. And then we can play, once we play our 3rd trick and treat, we get 1 more unit, which if we are that desperate for units, we could even call a 2nd Strega, who would get us another unit. And then, considering one of those trick and treats drew us a card and was card neutral, and the first and third trick and treats each got us a unit card, we end up going plus. So it's pretty easy to have a card from your hand that you can commit to the board, whether it be one of the Stregas so that you don't have to call one from drop zone, or an Eldeel, or our Searcher. It can be quite easy for us to build a board. At no point during her testing was she struggling to fill her board. It was quite easy for her, and so she never thought it was going to be necessary to have a card like that that would just call itself from drop zone. It could be nice and all, but she just felt like all of the slots are so impactful, even making room for a one-up fun of it wasn't necessarily worth her time. If you would like to try that card because you were all in on plussing as much as possible and committing as few cards from your hand as possible, then that could be a decent choice to try, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's going to be very important. The card that you might notice we're not playing any of from the new set is her new triple rare support. Her name is Go to the Light Replay, Replei. And that card is a little better than I initially thought. When I first recorded the video, I thought it checked top 5 for a trick and treat. But it's actually Energy Blast 3 to check the top 7 for a trick and treat, which I know doesn't sound like a big difference. Oh, it's 2 more cards. But if you check, I told you, StatTrek.com, Hypergeometric Distribution Calculator, you will find that a top 7 check is significantly more likely to have a target than a top 5 check. And it's a decent card. If it gets plus 5 if you played 1 order, it gets plus 10 if you played 3, and then it can retire itself at the end of the turn to draw you 1 card. It's a very good card for sure sometimes, and that's part of what made Alicia not feel very compelled to play it, because it's Energy Blast 3 to maybe get a trick and treat. Well, of course, considering the way the math of our deck was built initially, right? We were built to have as many trick and treats as possible, so those top 7 checks would hit, right? But once we've thinned out 4 trick and treats using our ride line, maybe we use this one to get out another, and then we nat draw 1 from all the drawing we're doing. We've thinned out 6 trick and treats, especially if you weren't already playing 15. The likelihood of that effect finding you a trick and treat can very quickly go to less than 50%, which is not where you want to be. Energy Blast 3 to shuffle your deck is actually kind of a downside when the Snow and Sorrow that was on the bottom of your deck that you were planning on searching later then gets sent and shuffled back in, and then you drive check it, and then you're like, oh, well, now not only can I not search it on my next turn, but I don't have shield. So it can be very bad to whiff a top 7 check. A top 7 check can be more likely to hit if you're playing more Snow and Sorrows, if you're playing it every turn, and the Snow and Sorrows are going back into your deck, and then you're shuffling with Strega. It can be a little problematic, for sure, but she felt that it was a better use of her energy to be using it for her bounce effects. She wants to be using Blooming Bop to have that defensive play, but it's also a consistency boost, right? Because we can use Blooming Bop to guaranteed counterblast 1, search our deck for Trick and Treat, play Trick and Treat, and then it'll immediately countercharge us 1 and draw. So it can be absolutely free if we can use Blooming Bop to not just get the additional Trick and Treats, but again, to get additional shield, because one of our deck's major weaknesses is a lack of shield. cards should not just be thought about as what helps you win more, but cards that can convert lost games to won games. And Blooming Bop can very much help with that. There are a lot of games where you would just be cooked because you don't have a perfect card. You know, Standard is not ruled by the overtrigger, but you always have to deal with its looming shadow. That card can show up and ruin your day at any time. So by having a perfect card in your back pocket can really help make your win rate just a little more consistent. And a little more can go a long way over multiple rounds of a larger tournament. It's not strictly related to this, but in lots of competitive games, like chess or online shooters, the difference between a player of a higher rank, like a gold player, versus that of a silver player, if you sit there and watch them, it's not like there's like, oh, this one weird trick that makes them much better. And like maybe for some players they are, like they just get it and another player doesn't. But it tends to be the culmination of lots of small things. Lots of little things add up over the course of the game to make it more likely that that player wins. You know, in chess, you might be more likely to find forks or pins and stuff like that, where another player is just not looking for those. Or maybe, like, yeah, you know forks, but they don't know pins. Or in the shooter game, you know how to better use your reloads or better time when you move from cover to cover. In Vanguard, that can be lots of little things about playing around triggers. Like you play around getting crit on this turn, you play around them checking defensives, you play around their heal triggers, and while just one of those things isn't enough to always win you a game, if you are consistently playing around all those little things, they will sum up into you having a higher win rate. And that's a lot of what she's been doing with this deck. It's a lot of little things. And if you don't like Bloomin' Bop Dragon, and you are a fan of using the new Triple Rare Girl, go to the light repli. You might want to consider playing a different card that allows you to return your rearguards to your hand. Sorry to do this to your budget, but those options are Franchette and Yuika. So if you heard me mention that and you go, actually, I don't think I want to play those cards, Blooming Bop is much more affordable. Much more affordable. So just be mindful of that. That it gives the deck a new dimension to it when you can use the cards from your drop zone, not just to build a board, but also to build a defense. And while the best defense is a good offense, killing them is the best crowd control, I would always say, in those games like League of Legends and Overwatch, right? That's the best crowd control, is death. They can't fight back if they're dead, right? The best defense can be a good offense. But if you are all offense, totally glass cannon, that saying doesn't necessarily hold up. And we kind of can be glass cannon. We have 15 orders that have no shield, plus the 3 Fenelles takes us to 18. Blooming Bop, while it might not have no shield printed on it, it actually has continuous. This unit gains intercept and 5k shield. So we actually don't have 20 shieldless cards in our deck, but over a third of our deck has no shield. I mean, 0 printed shield value. 0. So even those 5k pokes can add up very quickly over the course of the game. The last Fennel specific support card that she's not playing that I thought was worth mentioning is her original double rare support. She's like a puppy kind of girl. Her name is Haunted Spot Iristana. It's an interesting one of, not Alicia, but a different Fennel player at our locals would usually play one of it. they were a Yu-Gi-Oh player, and they are still a Yu-Gi-Oh player. And Yu-Gi-Oh players have a bit of a saying. If you draw it, that's fine. If you don't, that's also fine. Where a card can be good to have, but you don't want to ever see multiples of it, and your deck works perfectly fine without it. So there's no need to clog up on cards that can be useless. So you just play one of it, and if you draw it, that's great, and it raises your ceiling. And if you don't draw it, well, your deck is going to work just fine. She lets you Soul Blast one to call a card from your drop zone. So she's just like a different Strega, and then she has on hit, search your deck for Trick and Treat. If you find one of her, then you can kind of consistently loop her by intercepting with her and then calling her back from the drop zone, and then using her skill to call another card from your drop zone. And then having that on hit pressure by swinging, like you can have like Fenelle give the crit to herself, give the crit to Strega, and then they were much more likely to swing with that last swing and try and push you to 5 than Alicia is. So then once you're dealing with all these huge attacks with crit, you become a lot more likely to say no guard to that one that's just 1 damage, much more likely. So then you get in that on hit skill, or you can mind game them into potentially blocking an attack that maybe they shouldn't. And playing, actually, before we move on, I just wanted to say that if you do play the new triple rare support, go to the light repli, it is important to consider that that card might use literally all of your energy. So if you're just modifying Alicia's deck, you will probably want to remove the 3 cards that cost energy for her, because it's very easy for you to use literally all of your energy on those top 7 checks. If you're using it every grade 3 turn, assuming you went first, we are a going first deck, so you would expect that slightly more than 50% of the time will be going first, because sometimes people will be playing against a going second deck. You will only have an extra 3 energy to spare, and like, yeah, you could use that on an ace unit, but then you might whiff a top 7 check and then go, oh snap, I really need to find an order, so you do an additional top 7 check. It's perfectly fine if you would like to play that card. Just be thoughtful when you do that if you are taking out all of your ability to self-bounce, you are cutting off an additional dimension of this deck. A deck like Grand Blue in Standard was very effective because it was able to use the drop zone calls in order to block, because blocking is a kind of interaction. We might not be able to use Denial Griffin in Standard to retire an opponent's attacking unit, but how we play our blocks is the closest thing we have to interaction on our opponent's turn. So turning our calls into something that not just for offense, but for defense can give us an entire new dimension to the deck, which is very impactful. Let's see. Another reason to consider playing more cards like that is because, as you saw, as I outlined here, we have 5 cards of each grade, and they fill our circles in a bit of an awkward way. We have 5 3s, 5 2s, and 5 1s, and this little graph I'm doing here is another nice little way of looking at your deck that I'd like to teach everybody as a third kind of graph. So I've shown graphs on your, not just your grade curve, which I've already done this video, but there's that turn curve where maybe a card is a grade 1, but its skill doesn't do anything until turn 3. Like if you watched the Ulk video, the card that recycles an Ulk from your drop zone to your hand isn't going to do anything until like turn 4. So it goes on a higher spot on your curve. A Persona Ride is a grade 3 card, but it's not going to do anything until turn 4. This other kind of graph here lets us see how our board develops and where our cards go. Sometimes you might notice that your deck has a lot of grade 2s, but some of them belong in the back row, or some of them don't want to go to the Guardian Circle at all. But sometimes you will try and put, like if you put the cards on what circle you want them to be in, you will find that like you could easily end up with a situation where it's like this, and you just have too much front row, and you could consider shaving some of these cards to play cards that can block well, or maybe then you can toss in some additional boosters. And as you can see here, without our perfect cards on our board, the Fenelle Persona rides don't really go on our board. Of course, they go on our Vanguard circle, so we put them here on our graph. We don't consistently fill up our board here, so again, making use of the bounce allows us to get really good use of that last circle, because otherwise we might be stretching ourselves thin by reusing some other unit cards that we might not necessarily have. But this allows us to have just that little bit more options. So returning to our grade sorted curve here, you can see we have 5 1s, 5 2s, and 5 3s. And if you check the hypergeometric distribution calculator, you will find that if you want to see a particular card on turn 2, you are favored to find it when you play 5 copies. So since we're playing 5 1s and 5 2s, we are relatively consistently going to be able to have 2 cards on our board, but that is not necessarily going to make for effective tri-laning, where we have a unit on each side that can attack, because our opponent could easily check a defensive trigger and then it'll shut our hold turn down. If we're bringing like 8, 10, 10, that can be a little sus. You know, they check a defensive and then we don't check an offensive, and then our turn just does nothing. So having boosters can be very clutch. So if you are going to touch anything, if you are going to cut anything, like you're thinking, 15 trick and treats is too many, 1, you better be cutting it for one of the cards that searches trick and treat, like a 4th copy of her, or the grade 2 that on hit searches trick and treat, or the grade 2 that checks the top 7. You need to have enough trick and treats. It is very easy to end up in certain end games where you just do not have enough. When she was playing 13 trick and treats, she would end up in end games where she just could not do the thing, and it was very frustrating. Of course, she was not at the time playing the top 7 check, and that is a lesson then that you can learn from her misfortune. If you're going to go to less than 15, you better be playing additional searchers. But even still, we can very effectively build a decent board, because Strega can effectively call us something behind our Vanguard, even if it's just a trigger card. Remember, we can use Bloom and Bop to bounce them to our hand, so it's not the end of the world, and we need shield. So like, yeah, 1 less trigger in our deck sucks, but we already thinned out a lot of trick and treats, so it's not like our deck has been completely anti-thinned. Adding this to our hand for shield later will come in clutch, so that we can actually hit a very important breakpoint here, especially if we have the Searcher, because if we can, if we've hit, like, if we on our grade 2 turn we've added 4 trick and treats to our hand, if we played one turn 1, pitched 1 to ride up, and then played 1 on turn 2, which I know is kind of silly, we have 3 in our drop zone, this card can get the plus 5k, so that if our opponent is on grade 1, Fenelle swings for 15, which is very challenging for our opponent to block, and this side lane swings for 23, which hits very big. If they don't check a defensive, that's not a 1-card block. If they do hit a defensive, they still need to use a trigger to guard it. Swinging 15 into 23 can be absolutely back-breaking. So when you're mulliganing, do not try and keep trick and treat. Try and find Strega. Strega is another part of our winning image I didn't necessarily spend too much time on, because I was focused on our grade 3 turns winning image. But how we get to that, our opponent having 2 damage, especially if we went first, is having a board like this. How is our opponent going to go to 2 damage if we're going poke, poke, poke? They can just block with a 5k, block with a trigger, and then if we check the trigger, they can block that and stay at 0. If we don't check a crit, then they can easily go to 1. However, if we're swinging for 15, 23, our opponent might very well go to 2, and that can put them at a very bad damage count. So that's a special treat for you if you stuck through the video. You get a better understanding of our winning image. Let's see. Let me review my notes here before we cover the lands. Oh yes, I didn't touch on new versus old Fenelle. The list from Puerto Rico, which I will link in the description, as well as Alicia's list, was playing 4 Persona rides. They were playing less trick and treats, so they were able to have just a few more slots. So the effective differences was they shaved a few cards here and there to make room for some one-ups, like this was the card that calls herself from the drop zone, and the energy cards were the searcher, but then -2 trick and treats for +1 Persona ride and 1 protection twin cast. Protection twin cast is a very strong card. And it's a Regal's piece that doesn't conflict with us playing our trick and treats. However, it's not necessarily enough. I know I was just harping on about how we need to have more shield, but they didn't have that same bounce engine we do, so they don't need shield the same way, whereas Alicia desperately wants trick and treats. They were playing 4 draw triggers. We'll go into that just a little more in a second. First, I need to finish talking about why they were playing the deck list the way they were. If you are going to be playing 4 Persona rides, you're going to want to make sure that all of the ones in your main deck are the new Fenelle, because the new Fenelle is very similar to the old one, but she's not contingent on you having resolved all 3 trick and treats. So she will gain the power even if you've just played 1. So in like end games, you can get your huge power buff even if you couldn't find everything. Early and on in the game, it should be consistent enough for you to find the first 3, and then if you have 4 Persona rides, it'll be pretty easy for you to get off the old Fenelle and onto new Fenelle. But I feel like 4 Persona rides might be a little excessive. I personally can't talk about that too much. I very regularly end up finding myself playing Gradius Gradale, the Regal's piece that's the chalice, the cup, because I'll be like, I'll have drawn 25 cards and I like damage check a Persona ride. I'm like, where are they? I drew half my deck. Why can't I draw a freaking Persona ride? If there were 4 in my deck, I knew I would have done it. And my Argo Siren deck cannot win unless it Persona ride. It has to Persona ride in order to win. So I'll end up playing that in certain decks. So I can't be too much of a negative Nancy on playing the 4th Persona ride, but it just feels a little excessive, especially considering how little shield we have and how much power Fenelle can give our front row. Fenelle can sometimes just be Persona ride. She gives our front row +10 on our first grade 3 turn. If we'd like discard trick and treats to our perfect guards and whatnot, we can end up in situations where Fennelle's getting like +20. So you don't necessarily need to be Persona riding all the time. Of course, it's nice to Persona ride, but if you are going to be playing extra copies of Fenelle, more than just the 4, I would not recommend playing a 5th Persona ride. That's crazy. Make sure that you get off of old Fenelle and onto new Fenelle as quickly as possible. Other than that, I mentioned the sequencing. If you're going to be playing Snow and Sorrow, you probably want to be playing that as your first trick and treat, and not as your last one, because then you won't be able to get the 2 calls from the drop zone. Trick and Treat's worst mode is the first one, so replacing that with Snow and Sorrow's effect is quite good. then, of course, it's a little sad that you can use Strega to search or to shuffle that Snow and Sorrow. But again, if you're going down to one Snow and Sorrow, then you can then use your Order Searcher to just snap it down, search that Snow and Sorrow right back to your hand, and there you go. Put it back and get it right back, and then you can just discard it to a perfect card, and you can have an efficient resource loop of sorts where you do the same thing over and over. And then it just gets bigger turn after turn after turn because Fenelle is slowly giving your front row power buffs. So even though this is an aggressive deck, we can have a very good grind game. She was able to use this to deck out my Alka-Sol deck in the tournament day where I was practicing that. While, of course, that was my initial draft and I wasn't gaining the +5s to my front row, and my deck could have been performing better. I'm still not 100% sure, even if my deck was like perfectly full final for me, if I could have broken through her. I think I still might have been decked out. So for a deck with so little shield as Fenelle, to be able to do that speaks volumes to the power of our resource loops. We can build a board for very little commitment from hand, and then we can reuse incredibly large amounts of shield by reusing our sentinels. I've covered the ride decks, calculator, cards we're playing and not playing, our energy usage, Blooming Bop Dragon, bouncing cards. Alright, so that sums up all of our non-land cards. So that just leaves our lands. If you want to be perfectly 100% optimal, you probably should not be playing Elementary Sanctitude, and you should be playing 4 normal unit perfect guards so that Strega can call it and that you can loop it more effectively. But I mean, come on. This is a prize card Elementaria. It might be a little tough to see because of the glare, but like, come on, what are you supposed to do? Not play your prize card Elementaria? Are you kidding me? Come on. Listen. It's not always about how good your deck is. What might be more important sometimes is how good your deck looks. And like, come on. You play that, they're like, what? Huh? You got top 4 to BCS? What? And she's like, no, actually, I won a BCS. It's pretty neat. You gotta flex sometimes, you know, it's important. Like in my Mythiarch deck, I play the frame rare triggers and just tell my opponent to pretend they have more shield, right? Having a very nice Elementaria is just too good. Like, what are you supposed to do? Not play your prize card Elementaria? Are you kidding me? Come on. But if you don't have a prize card Elementaria, you probably might want to max out and play the 4th perfect guard. Come back to those. Alicia is playing 8 crit, 4 heal, of course, 3 front, and when she's feeling like playing the overtrigger, because she doesn't always, the correct overtrigger to play is red overtrigger, the Spiritual King of Ignition Volnute, or one of its alternate artworks. Since you have a unit with a crit on rearguard, thanks to Fenelle, giving a unit the ability to restand and 100 million means you can swing for 100 million with crit twice, meaning you're threatening 4 damage that must be sentineled. So if they used a sentinel on Fenelle foolishly a little too early, and they were at that 2 damage count I'm always talking about, if you can feed them that 2nd damage, then this can just obliterate them off the face of the earth, which is kind of what you want your overtrigger to do, right? That a lost game is converted to a win when you check this on offense. Think about Heart Luru, right? When they check red OT, you just die. It's kind of the same thing with Fenelle. If she checks red overtrigger, you're dead. She was playing effect crits for a long time because in theory, the 4K body might not mean too much when Fenelle's giving your front row all these like strange power buffs like plus 14 plus 16, something like that. And then moving it to soul to get an additional +2 to make up for the fact that you're like 1 +2 short of hitting important break. It very much could come up, but after lots and lots of testing, it just never once did it come up. So theoretically, you could be playing those, but she wants to play the cute puppy girl crit and the Halloween crit because it matches the theme. And like, I mean, come on, how can you blame somebody for wanting to have good looking lands, right? If it doesn't matter, then you might as well have the cards that look good. However, one of the things that does matter is that she's playing the vanilla heals. And Alicia is a big believer in the heals that counter opponent's units when they restand, as much as that is very important. And you can usually make up for the fact that in some matchups they don't have the 5k shield, because you think about it, you oftentimes find yourself over guarding certain attacks where you just need to throw down a trigger. You can usually save them and then find a time to get rid of them, but we don't have any shield. That's not a luxury we can afford to just sit and hold on to a piece of shield. We don't have very many, so we need to have all the shield available to us at all times, so we never want to be caught with our metaphorical pants down. And then lastly, there are these front triggers. The list from Puerto Rico was playing draws, which I can understand. Playing 4 draws makes me a little sad. Just a little sad. A lot sad. Makes Alicia extra big sad. It makes her snow in sorrow, actually. Unfortunately, we've already hit the 1 hour mark, so I'm not going to bother trying to wrap this up quickly. So I'll take some time breaking down fronts and draws for y'all just before we wrap up. Sorry that we went over an hour, but this I'm tired after recording it the first time. I had a lot more caffeine in my system the first time. Then like the lighting was, it was so blah because I'm wearing all white and I'm so pale, and then the clouds made it extra bright in here and everything was just so washed out. And I didn't want to record. It was the sun, because then the sun will go down, the lighting will change halfway through, and I took it off automatic, blah 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 blah. Hopefully you can enjoy the ASMR podcast with me. But I can understand wanting to have draws, because we kind of need to see quite a lot of pieces to get our engines turning. But playing cards with less shield in our deck with very little shield can come to bite us in the butt very quickly. So a interesting tech for y'all at home, if you are experimental, if you're a scientist like me, you might want to consider trying out 2 fronts and 2 draws. This is a interesting little tech that me and a teammate of mine back in Vegas, Kami, both of us would do this fairly regularly, where, listen, you could just always feel that you need like 1 more card. You're just like always 1 card short of doing the thing. And if you're playing 2 more draws in your deck, or if you're playing 2 draw triggers in your deck, you will be surprised the amount of games in which you check them. I mean, of course, as I've been doing some of my experimental trigger testing, I've played games with 4 draws and checked none 3 games in a row, which is I'm going to call that a statistical outlier, but there have been many tournaments, large tournaments in V, where I'd played 1 singular draw trigger in my Grand Blue deck, and the amount of times I checked it is astonishing. It comes up a lot. Think about how many, it's just 1 over trigger, think about how many times it changes the game. 1 draw trigger can go a long way, and 2, it kind of helps split the difference. You know, at 1 is kind of meh. If you are very sketched out on ever going below 8 crit, then I can understand. You might want to just like pick playing, you can have 1 draw and 2 fronts, or 2 fronts and 1 draw, because it can be nice to have the additional card in rotation, but we need the shield. And fronts not only have more shield, but they have more offensive pressure as well, because when you check one, that's 30,000 power added to your board and 20,000 shield added to your hand, whereas a draw trigger is only going to add 10,000 power to your board and minimum 10,000 shield to your hand. Yeah, maximum you could draw your over trigger and you could have had 60,000 shield to your hand, but if you calculate the average shield value of your deck, you will find that your draw trigger is going to will be worth less shield on average than your front trigger is. Which brings me to, since we've broken the 1 hour mark, I feel like I can have just a little bit of story time. Back in my day, back way long ago, I think it was about 10 years ago at this point. Gosh, it's been that long. Back on Pojo forums. Gosh, remember forums, guys? A guy whose handle was Timmy Power Gamer sat down and did the math. He showed us all of his work and everything, and he proved mathematically that crits are objectively better than draw triggers. Not just because of the pressure they provide, that was like factored in, but even if you don't count that, the amount of shield they give you on average is just less than that of your crit. Once everything evens out, your crit is going to give you more shield. And this was back before crits had more like 15k shield, where and draws have 5. Back when crits only gained 5k, when give you 5k, not 10. They speed up the game by a turn, which matters a lot. You have to block less when the game goes one less turn. So they provide you shield in the same way that the best defense is a good offense. And in a sense, that is still kind of true. But, you know, draws do have slightly more shield now. It's still the same shield gap. And we are playing even less shield on average than other decks were. So, in a sense, it is still a little suspicious to be playing draw triggers. If you look at what triggers other than crits and heals decks are playing at large events, you can check on the VG Paradox website. He does a little bit of data analysis, not as much as yours truly, but he has these little reports you can see, and you will find that the most played generic card for almost every nation is the front trigger, because they offer more numbers. In Vanguard, as much as there's a lot of skill involved with the interaction of do you swing with this first and that second, it does in the end boil down to a sort of numbers game, and not necessarily a fair one at that. I bring up the ancient game of Nim, but you can get to you would get to points where you feed somebody a poison number, where once you have that, it is if you know a strategy, it can be deterministically over. I think of like there was some anime episode where Michiru, the Jejuled player, plays against the Bavsagra player, and she crits him early, and most people would think that that's like, oh no, I'm in a bad position, but he is able to effectively recognize that lets him, 1, counter push harder, and 2, go up to a high enough damage count where she cannot heal for the rest of the game, and they make a point of showing it in her last triple drive. She's at 4 damage and checks a heal trigger that doesn't resolve because Michiru's at 5. Then when it goes around to Michiru's turn, if she could have just said no guard to one more attack, then she would have won. But because he was able to effectively play around the poison number of the damage counts without letting her heal out of it, he's able to effectively pivot that. And fronts help not specifically with the poison numbers all the time, but they help us to make it so that our opponent's no guard decisions become a little less impactful, where everything gets plus 10. So now you can't just fade off which one has the crit. Both of them got plus 10. I check this crit. So like the crit you check crit front. Now you can't dodge it. Now you can't say no guard to the smaller one or to the bigger one and then block the small one. Now they both have the power gain. And fronts objectively provide more numbers than draws. They give you more on offense and they give you more on defense. But it's not all about numbers, right? This isn't literally the game of Nim. We have a lot more options. We have ways of pivoting our cards to do things. And if you are constantly finding yourself one card short, then I would recommend giving like 1 or 2 draw triggers a shot, and you'll be surprised. Because like if you were just playing 3 draws, then you're not gonna have enough shield. But if you have the fronts tossed in there as well, then you will have the 1 more card per game, but you will also have the shield value you need so you don't get caught at those poison numbers. You need the shield to prevent yourself from going to those, right? Like if we're trying to swing at our opponent for 15, imagine if they could use the fronts and go to 30 early, then they could very much avoid that poison number. But they cannot, so it gives us a nice advantage. All right, I think that about wraps up story time. Moral of the story, you should probably be playing fronts, but you know, give draws a shot every now and again. Draws are not necessarily always strictly worse. They give you an extra card, which gives you an extra option. Maybe your front is like, they're gonna do a whole bunch of pokes and that's gonna be too much shield on one attack and you'd like to spread it out. Maybe you just need 1 more card to discard to a perfect guard. You just need to see 1 more card so that you can find that last trick and treat. They are not strictly worse nowadays, because options do matter, and getting 1 card closer to your, because it doesn't matter how much shield you have in your hand when your opponent swings you for 100 million, right? You just need to dig a little closer to find your wonderful card with infinite shield. And don't be too afraid to cut one singular crit. Every crit matters, and it is usually correct to be playing a crit. But of course, you get diminishing returns the more of them you play. So the 5th crit is has X amount of impact. The 6th crit has slightly less than X amount. As Y amount, which is slightly less than X. This has Z amount of impact, which is slightly less than Y. And then of course, we are left with Omega, which will have the slightly less impact overall. So by removing just that last one that has the least impact overall, it's not felt that much. But again, it is very important to be checking crits, especially with this deck, because if we get them to 4, right? And we swing Fenelle with crit, our rearguard already has a crit, and then we check a crit, and then we have all 3 lanes swinging with crit. It can be absolutely devastating. So I totally understand that you probably should be playing 8 crit, but if you play this deck for a while and you play 1 draw and you're just like, yeah, I want to play another, but I want to play the fronts, you can do a cheeky little 2-2 split. Me and my teammate Kami would do that relatively often. I think both of us arrived at that in Jet format back in at Spring Fest, where Chrono Jet was the hotness. We both ended up playing 2 draws and 2 fronts, because the extra draws let you have just a little bit more options, but the fronts make it so that you're not getting caught with your pants down on the lack of shield. The 2 draws reduce the amount of shield, and then the 2 fronts return that shield up to where it should be. The draws give you more options, and the fronts give you more numbers. So everything balances out in the end. All right, that is everything. I'm sorry to make it go a little longer with the additional story time, but I figured since I already broke the 1 hour mark, where's the harm, right? It's only like 10 more minutes. If you're gonna watch this long, well, might as well watch the whole thing, right? Thank you all very, very much for watching. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, you hopefully liked it. So I would ask you very nicely to please leave a like. It really helps out. And there's a secret feature on youtube.com where if you put a video as a like, it ends up in a list of sorts that you can search through later to find it. So you can come back to this video in the future if you need to find a Fenelle deck list. It'll be a way of bookmarking it of sorts. This was the last video that was viewer requested a while ago. One of y'all asked for lists for Fenelle, Sweet Linker, and Ulk, and we've done that. I read every comment, maybe not as soon as you post it, but as soon as I post my next video, then I go back and I look through all the comments of the old videos, and I am more than happy to make what y'all want to watch. So we have access to a very large card pool. Set 12 just came out with deep lands and a new silhouette. So if you'd like to see anything from the new set, or if there's some other deck that you'd like to see, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. Thank you all so much for watching. I know I've said that before, but I really, really mean that. Thank you. Spread love, y'all, and be kind.